This episode is part 2 of And in the East. In our last episode, we took a brief look at the Apostle Thomas's mission into India. We then considered the spread of the faith into Persia. Further study of the Church of the East has to return to the Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century, where Bishop Nestorius was condemned as a heretic. Now, as we've seen, the debate about the deity of Christ that was central to the Council of Nicaea back in 325 declared that Jesus was the same substance as the Father. It took another 100 years before the deity-denying error of Arianism was finally quashed. But even among Orthodox and Catholic Nicene-holding believers, the question was over how to understand the nature of Christ. Okay, we've got it. He's God, he's also human. How are we to understand this dual nature? It was at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 that the issue was finally decided. Bishop Nestorius was labeled a heretic, and the Church of the East, that really took off with the distortion of Nestorius' ideas, was regarded by the Western Church as unorthodox. The debate was sophisticated and complex, and not a small part decided more by politics than by a concern for theological purity. To make a complex issue simple, those who emphasized the unity of the two natures of Christ came to be known as Monophysites, while those who emphasized Jesus' dual natures were known as Diophysite. Monophysites regarded Diophysite as heretics, while the Diophysite gladly returned the favor. By the dawn of the 6th century, there were three main branches of the Christian church. The Church of the West, which looked to Rome and Constantinople for leadership. The Church of Africa, with its great center at Alexandria and an emerging center at that time in Ethiopia. And the Church of the East, with its center first in Syria and then later in Persia. As we saw in the last episode, the Church of the East was launched from Edessa at the border between Syria and eastern Turkey. The theological school there was transferred to Nisibis in eastern Turkey in 471. It was led by the brilliant theologian Narsai. Now, this school had 1,000 students who went out from there to lead the churches of the East. Several missionary endeavors were also launched from Nisibis, just as Iona was a sending base for Celtic Christianity in the far northwest, something that we'll be taking a look at soon. The Eastern Church mounted successful missions among the nomadic people of the Middle East and Central Asia between about the mid-5th century through the 7th century. These included church planting efforts among the Huns. Abraham of Kaskar, who lived during the 6th century, did much to plant monastic communities throughout the East. During the first 1,200 years, the Church of the East grew both geographically and numerically, far more than the Church in the West. The primary reason for this was that in the East, missionary work was largely a movement of the laity. As Europe moved into the Middle Ages with its strict feudal system, travel came to a virtual standstill, while in the East, trade and commerce grew. That resulted in the movement of increasing numbers of people who carried the faith with them. Another reason that the Church of the East grew was persecution. As we saw in the last episode, before Constantine, the persecutions of the Roman Empire had pushed a large number of believers eastward. Then, when the Sassanids began the great persecution of Christians in Persia, that sent large numbers of the faithful south and even further east. Following the persecution that came under Shapur II, another far more severe round of persecution broke out in the mid-5th century that saw 10 bishops and over 150,000 Christians massacred in just a few days. When we think of Arabia, many immediately think of Islam, but Christianity had taken root in the peninsula long before Muhammad came on the scene. In fact, a bishop from Qatar was present at the Council of Nicaea in 325. The Arabian queen Muawiyah, whose forces defeated the Romans in 373, insisted on receiving an Orthodox bishop before she would make peace with the Romans. There was a mission outreach to the southeastern region of Arabia in what today is known as Yemen before the birth of Muhammad by both Nestorian and Monophysite missionaries. And by the opening of the 6th century, there were dozens of churches all along the Arabian shore of the Persian Gulf. The rise of Islam in the 7th century was to have far-reaching consequences for the Church of the East. The Persian capital at Ctesiphon fell to the Arabs in 637. Since the church there had become a kind of Rome to the Church of the East, the impact of that in conquest was massive. Muslims were sometimes tolerant of religious minorities, but only as communities of the disenfranchised known as the dhimmi. They became ghettos that were stripped of their vitality. At the same time that the Church of the East was being shredded by Muslim conquests, it was taking one of its biggest steps forward by reaching into China in the mid-7th century. Well, the Church of the West grew mostly by the work of trained clergy and the missionary monks of Celtic Christianity. In the East, as often as not, it was Christian merchants and craftsmen who advanced the faith. The Church of the East placed a great emphasis on education and literacy. It was understood that being a follower of Jesus meant an education that included reading, writing, and theology. An educated laity meant an abundance of workers capable of spreading the faith, and spread it they did. Christians often found employment among less advanced peoples, serving in government offices, as teachers, secretaries. They helped some of the problem of illiteracy by inventing simplified alphabets based on the Syriac language, which framed their own literature and theology. While that was at first a boon, in the end it proved kind of a hindrance. Those early missionaries failed to understand the principle of contextualization, that the gospel is supracultural. It transcends things like language and tradition. Those early missionaries who pressed rapidly into the East assumed that their version of the faith, that is the Syrian-speaking version, was the only version, and tried to convert those that they met to that. Not Christianity, but to a Syrian-flavored Christianity. As a consequence, while a few did accept the faith and learn Syrian Aramaic, a few generations later, the old religions and languages just reasserted themselves, and Christianity was either swept away or it was so assimilated into the culture that it wasn't really a biblically faithful faith any longer. The golden age of early missions in Central Asia was from the end of the 4th century to the later part of the 9th. Then, both Islam and Buddhism came on the scene. Northeast of Persia, the church had an early and extensive spread around the Oxus River. Today it's known as the Amu Darya. By the early 4th century, the cities of Merv, Herat, and Samarkand had bishops. Once the faith was established in this region, it spread quickly further east into the basin of the Tarim River, and then into the area north of there, the Tian Shan Mountains, and Tibet. It spread along this path because that was the premier caravan route through the region. With so many Christians engaged in trade, it was natural that the gospel was soon planted in the caravan centers. In the 11th century, the faith began to spread among the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian regions. These Christians were mostly from the Tartars and the Mongol tribes, the Karaites, Ongut's, Uyghurs, Naimans, and Merkits. It's not clear exactly when Christianity reached Tibet, but it most likely arrived there by the 6th century. The territory of the ancient Tibetans stretched farther west and north than the present-day nation, and they had extensive contact with the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. A vibrant church existed in Tibet by the 8th century. The patriarch of the Assyrian church in Mesopotamia, Timothy I, wrote from Baghdad in 782 that the Christian community in Tibet was one of the largest groups under his oversight. He appointed a Tibetan patriarch to oversee the many churches there. The center of the Tibetan church was located at Lhasa, and the church thrived there until the late 13th century when Buddhism swept through the region. An inscription carved into a large boulder at the entrance to the pass at Sangsi, once a part of Tibet but now in India, has 3 crosses with some writing indicating the presence of the Christian faith. The pass was one of the main ancient trade routes between Lhasa and Bactria. The crosses are stylistically from the Church of the East, and one of the words appears to be Jesus. Another inscription reads this, quote, "In the year 210 came Nosfarm from Samarkand as emissary to the Khan of Tibet," unquote. Now, that might not seem like a reference to Christianity until you take a closer look at the date, 210. That only makes sense in reference to measuring time since the birth of Christ, which was already a practice in the church. The aforementioned Timothy I became patriarch of the Assyrian church in about 780. His church was located in the ancient Mesopotamian city of Seleucia, which was the larger twin to the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. He was 52, well past the average life expectancy for people of that time, And yet Timothy lived to be into his 90s, dying in 823. During his long life, he devoted himself to spiritual conquest as energetically as Alexander the Great had to the military kind of a conquest. While Alexander built an earthly empire, Timothy sought to expand the kingdom of God. At every point, Timothy's career smashes everything that we think we know about the history of Christianity at that time. He alters ideas about the geographical spread of the faith, its relationship with political power, its cultural influence, and its interaction with other religions. In terms of his prestige and the geographical extent of his authority, Timothy was the most significant Christian leader of his day, far more influential than the Pope in Rome or the Patriarch in Constantinople. A quarter of the world's Christians looked to him as both a spiritual and a political leader. No responsible historian of Christianity would leave out Europe. Omitting Asia from the record is just as unthinkable. We can't understand Christian history without Asia or Asian history without Christianity. The Church of the East cared little for European developments. Timothy I knew about his European contemporary, Charlemagne. The Frankish ruler exchanged diplomatic missions with the Muslim Caliphate, a development of which the leader of the Church of the East would have been well apprised. Timothy also knew Rome had its own leader called the Pope. He was certainly aware of the tension between the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople over who was the de facto leader of the Christian world. Timothy probably thought their squabble silly. Wasn't it obvious that the Church of the East was heir to the primitive church? If Rome drew its authority from Peter, Mesopotamia looked to Christ himself. After all, Jesus was a descendant of that ancient Mesopotamian Abraham. And wasn't Mesopotamia the original source of culture and civilization? Not to mention the location of the Garden of Eden? It was the East rather than the West that first embraced the gospel. The natural home of Christianity was in Mesopotamia and points east. According to the geographical wisdom of that time, Seleucia stood at the very center of the world's routes of trade and communication, equally placed between the civilizations that looked respectively to the West and to the East. All over the lands of modern-day Iraq and Iran, believers built huge and enduring churches. Because of its setting close to the Roman frontier, but far enough beyond to avoid interference, Mesopotamia retained a powerful Christian culture that lasted through the 13th century. Throughout the European Middle Ages, the Mesopotamian church was as much a cultural and spiritual Christian headquarters as France or Germany, or even that outstanding missionary base of Ireland. Several Mesopotamian cities like Basra, Mosul, Kirkuk, and Tikrit were thriving centers of Christianity for centuries, even after the arrival of Islam. In 800 AD, these churches and the schools that were attached to them were repositories of the classical scholarship of the Greeks, Romans, and Persians that Western Europe would not have access to for another 400 years. Simply put, there was no dark age in the Church of the East. From Timothy I's perspective, the culture and scholarship of the ancient world was never lost. More importantly, the Church of the East countenanced no break between the primitive church that rose in Jerusalem in the book of Acts and themselves. Now consider this. We can easily contrast the Latin-speaking feudal world of the European Middle Ages with the ancient Middle Eastern church rooted in a Greek and Aramaic-speaking culture. The medieval church of Europe saw itself as pretty far removed from the early church. Both in language and thought forms, they were culturally distinct and distant. But in Timothy I's time, that is the early 9th century, the Church of the East still spoke Greek and Aramaic. Its members shared the same basic Middle Eastern culture and would continue to do so for centuries. As late as the 13th, they still called themselves Nazarenes, a title that the very first Christians had used. They called Jesus Yeshua. Clergy were given the title Rabban, meaning teacher or master, related to that Hebrew word rabbi. Eastern theologians used the same literary style as the authors of the Jewish Talmud, rather than the theological works of Western Europe. As Philip Jenkins says in his book, The Lost History of Christianity, if we ever wanted to speculate on what the early church might have looked like if it had developed while avoiding its alliance with Roman state power, we have but to look to the East. Repeatedly, we find Patriarch Timothy I referring to the fact that the churches of the East used texts that were lost to and forgotten in the West. Because of their close proximity to the setting of so much Jewish and early Christian history, Eastern scholars had abundant access to ancient scriptures and texts. One hint of what was available comes from one of Timothy's letters. Written about 800, Timothy was answering the questions of a Jew in the process of converting to Christianity. Now, this Jew told the patriarch of the recent finding of a large hoard of ancient manuscripts, both biblical and apocryphal, in a cave near Jericho. These documents had been acquired by Jerusalem's Jewish community. Without much doubt, that was an early find of what would later come to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And thank God, this early find didn't move a bunch of treasure hunters to ransack the other caves of the area. In any case, as now, the scholars were thrilled at the discovery. Timothy responded with all the appropriate questions. He wanted to know what light the find might shed on some passages of Scripture he was curious about. He was eager to discover how the newfound texts compared with the known Hebrew versions of the Old Testament. How did they compare with the Greek Septuagint? Timothy was delighted to hear back that the passages that he was concerned about did indeed exist in the ancient manuscripts. Timothy's questions are impressive when we compare them to what Western Latin scholars would have made of such a find. They had no idea the issues that Timothy was raising. They could not even have read the language of the ancient manuscripts. Only a handful of Western scholars would even know how to hold the manuscripts. For instance, which way was up? How do you read them, from left to right or vice versa? The Church of the East that Timothy I led was devoted to both scholarship and missionary activity. While the Latin Church saw the Atlantic Ocean as a wall blocking expansion to the west, the Church of the East saw Asia as a vast region just waiting to be evangelized. The Eastern Church was divided into regions called metropolitans, and then the term metropolitan was also used for the church leaders of that region, much like an archbishop, under whom were several bishops, to whom a number of priests and their churches reported. To give you an idea of how vast the Church of the East was, Timothy had 19 metropolitans and 85 bishops reporting to him. In the West, England had 2 archbishops. During Timothy's tenure as patriarch, 5 new metropolitan sees were created near Tehran, in Syria, Turkestan, Armenia, and one on the Caspian Sea. Arabia had at least 4 bishops, and Timothy ordained a new one in Yemen. Timothy I was to the Church of the East what Gregory I had been to the Western Church in terms of missionary zeal. He commissioned monks to carry the faith from the Caspian Sea all the way to China. He reported the conversion of the great Khagan, who ruled most of Central Asia. Now, in our next episode, we're going to take a look at the gospel reach into the Far East. And as we end, may I say, if you're enjoying Communio Sanctorum, History of the Christian Church, would you please like, subscribe, and invite others? You can also check on the other content on the Into His Image YouTube channel. I'm now adding entire Bible book studies that I've done at the church where I serve as pastor, and a series called Short Takes, which are quick biblical worldview perspectives on issues pertinent to this cultural moment.